Hey folks, we're finally at it. We are going to break down the State of Warlock video in the next coming days. We're going to have a breakdown of all the dungeons, and we're going to talk about the specs as they went through it. We're going to be starting with Affliction, as the thumbnail suggests, and no, it is not clickbait. I did hit 224k DPS during a pack, and then proceeded to also scare the ever-living crap out of the rest of my team while running this key. So, let's get into it, analyze it, and talk about the strengths of Affliction. So, as the video starts, the thing to mention is this is a Grim Reach build, so we are looking at fully maximizing the AoE that is about to happen, because as you know, Gambit, a lot of the trash is done here early, and we're going to go into it. So, this is a huge big pull. You can see that I've had the unending resolve because I am likely to take aggro, and it is obviously quaking this particular week. Now, you can see that the burst has already happened, and we're kind of going to talk about why it happens as we go through the rest of this dungeon. Now, for those of you that don't know, or new to Affliction, part of our AoE tool set is called Soul Flame. It's a passive talent, essentially, and what it does, if we go back to the start of the pack, when something dies, it detonates for a portion of damage that hits all targets within its vicinity. Now, this particular trash pack is ideal for it because everything has different health pools. You can see we have a mix of 134Ks, we have a couple of 526Ks, 643, we've got a couple of 111-12Ks, we've got a couple of infiltrators with 768K, and this puts us in perfect territory for making use of Soulflame. Not only that, but with this build having access to Vile Taint, which mass applies our Agony, Seed of Corruption, Agonizing Corruption, we can get our dots rapidly stacked. Like you can already see in such a short time at the start of this pull, while, you know, our tank and Red Paladin are starting their burst sufficiently, we're still technically ramping. So you might not be able to see it for the video, but while this is going on and we're setting up, we're only at 4.3k DPS, and our Fire Mage is even lower. But this is kind of how quickly our ramp happens, especially when you have trash that does kind of fall over this quickly. Because Soul Flame's actual automated or spell effect area is this purple area that you can see here, and you can see that it's hit everything for 9.3k. And this is everything that's in it. So the moment something dies, it essentially detonates, a bit like a living bomb for those of you that play mages. So everything has now just been hit for 9.3k, and this has hit 20, 30, 40 targets. But then that further sets off a chain effect, and you can see that at the moment we've paused this pull has been going on for 13 seconds. And as a result, I'm at 2.74 million damage done, and that's averaging a 209k DPS. Comparatively, like our Fire Mage, like I'm doing the combined damage of everybody else in this group at this current moment because of the interactions of Soulflame and how it works with health pools. So we'll continue playing the video, and we'll just let it play through as we talk about what this means for Affliction then, and what it means going into Dragonflight, where our damage is going to lie. Now, some of this damage is obviously being augmented by the fact that I do have my Dark Glare doing some work for us at this point. You can see that it's out through my weak auras. And we've kind of just cleaned up that pack, doing 5 million damage, and our Fire Mage has done 3, which is nothing to be sniffed at. Fire Mages are doing a fantastic job at the moment, and I do a really bad job there of getting myself shadow locked. But you can see that we've thrown out a Seed of Corruption, we then Vile Taint with that slight moment of lag, and the reason we're doing it in that order is because obviously we have a little bit of time before Seed of Corruption detonates, and the damage from Vile Taint will cause it to detonate, which means that between the two, especially with Seed of Corruption, Sow the Seeds, Agonizing Corruption, we can very rapidly stack up all our dots on a pack in the space of 2 casts, which then gives us time to Haunt, UA, and then just go into a basic rotation. This was a little bit of miscommunication in terms of the actual key itself. where our tank decided he just wanted to go and do some stuff. But you can see that this time I actually Vile Taint and then go into Seed of Corruption because I want the Agonies rolling because this is a very small pack. But again, Soul Flame just detonated half that pack there, and our damage spikes as a result. I think the end summary of this dungeon was Soul Flame was responsible for close to about 40% of my total damage, which from a balancing perspective is kind of problematic, and it does mean that there are going to be certain dungeons in Dragonflight where we are much stronger than we may seem initially, and that's because of how the pack sizes work. A good example of this would be Egilthar Academy, which is going to be available in Season 1. That particular dungeon has quite a lot of reasonably large packs with multiple health pools. You can see here, this is another good example. We have 2 packs, we can go into it, we're going to use our Grim Reach, Vile Taint, and it doesn't really matter what anyone else does. Like, our Retribution Paladin is doing work, but you can see that even on this relatively tame pack, we're still able to pump out 75k AoE DPS. And we're not necessarily having as much effect with Soul Flame because not everything's as stacked. We have a couple of leapers in the form of the wave jumpers, and they are getting out of it. But still, between that and Grim Reach, we have this. This particular build, it does need to be said, is slightly stronger in the pre-patch than it will be in Dragonflight, in terms of how frequently we get our Dark Glare. This is because in terms of conduits, I am also running Corrupting Leer. So every time Agony deals damage, it has a chance to reduce the cooldown of Dark Glare. Pair this with something like Wilfred's, and all of a sudden your Dark Glare goes from being a 2-minute cooldown to like a 45-second to a minute cooldown, which lines up really nicely with Soul Rot. So it is very beneficial. The flip side of losing the Dark Glare going into Dragonflight will actually be the fact that we'll have access to a second capstone in terms of other bottom of our talents. And depending on how you want to play, you will have the option of either further delving into AoE, keeping Soul Rot, having Decaying Soul Satchel, Wrath of Consumption, and having a full AoE build to go to town. At the moment, I'm currently typing out my to my guild, because this was a guild run. All of us are guildies, and they were asking me in party chat what the hell my build was at this point, because I think I was catching them all unawares as to how Warlock actually plays. The result of that, unfortunately, does mean that we end up with a few deaths, and this becomes a kiting moment between me and Mello, with Mello booking it behind me, and me being the attention of everyone's aggro. All hail being a Warlock at this point, I will be said. But as I was saying, in terms of the strength of this spec going into Dragonflight, because we have access to a second capstone, we can decide how we want to play. We can either go deeper into AoE and play a 2-minute build very much like what we currently have, with the Soul Rot, Decaying Soul Satchel, and being able to reduce the cooldown of Soul Rot itself through our UA, Unstable Affliction, and as a result having this 1-minute, 2-minute cycle of AoE damage. Or we can actually delve a little bit into single target damage via Haunt, and having Haunt increase the damage all our dots do by 20%. This then is going to passively improve an element of our AoE when we don't have our cooldown, but at the same time is going to help improve our single target damage by a fair amount when you consider the amount of dots that we'll have rolling, and we'll have things like Empowered Corruption and things like that. So the build as is, its strengths are going to shift slightly, but it's still going to be strong, especially in those dungeons, as I said, where you're going to have packs where they're very large pulls, or they're pulls of targets with differing healths, because this then feeds into Affliction's strength. For single target, though, especially currently in the pre-patch, we do suffer a little bit. As I say, I am playing Nightfare for this dungeon rather than Necrolord, and even with the Necrolord nerfs to Affliction, there is still very much a definite choice Affliction needs to make in terms of how you are going to approach pre-patch dungeons. Are you going to be more single target focused? At which point you may want to be running the Capstone Haunt Tread anywhere over Dark Glare, or do you want to be playing AoE? Now, as we've discussed many a time on the channel, especially for the older audience among you that have been with me for a while, you'll know that we've had discussions in the past as to which is more beneficial over the course of a key. Do you focus on AoE or do you focus on single target? Now, even though this is a tyrannical week, due to the nature of how much trash there was, especially here in Gambit, with 60%, nearly 62% of our total damage or total key being done in this first section, the faster we can get through that trash, the faster we can get onto the bosses and get the key done. So it's a better investment, especially for Affliction at this stage, to do something like a Grim Reach build. Now, if you want kind of consistency, we can talk about that when we get to the Destruction videos and the Demonology videos, but for Affliction, we're kind of looking more at having this being the AoE powerhouse, essentially, and you can see that our Ret Paladin is in fact doing a lot of the single target damage for us. Unfortunately, he does go down there, which causes us a slight problem, because we have to resurrect him. We've then got someone doing the weak aura for us, and then we know where to run to. I will admit I am looking forward to this kind of mechanic hopefully going away, because it's kind of problematic when you've got so many weak auras and add-ons and stuff that you need to track and make sure that you have if you want to do keys. But that aside, you can see as though when I talk about the fact that we are lacking single target damage, because we're running Haunt as a single talent, so we still have access to it for a dot. We're making sure that our Vial tains out when we Dark Glare anyway, because remember, our Dark Glare's damage is increased by the amount of dots it has active, and Vial Taint does also leave its own dot, plus Soul Rod's dot, UAs, things like that, and maintaining Shadow Embrace, we're still able to do a reasonable amount of single target damage. Unfortunately, at this point, I did lag out. Little bit of an unstable connection at the time we were doing this key, but it still kind of proves a point. Like, we were able to do 15.3k. Now, in terms of changing that from Season 3 to Season 4 to Prepatch, that's not too much of a change. Really. We've lost a little bit, but we more than make up for it in our AoE settings. As you can see, at the moment we're averaging 34k DPS across the dungeon, and our Fire Mage Mellow is doing a whopping job at 32. Ned is bringing up the rear slightly, but I believe Ned, who is a new Retribution Paladin to the guild and joining us, is actually gearing his Ret up. So his Ret's not the best geared in comparison to me and Mellow, who are like 303 item level-ish region. So very much we overgear this. But we're all just kind of getting used to our specs. Now, you can see this pack wasn't the greatest for me, partially due to count, partially due to lag, but also just generally not necessarily being as switched on as I should be. Because if we go back slightly, you can see that I don't actually have as much available as I should. Like, we get most of it out, but then I Soul Rot, and then I've got to move out. And Dark Glare's going, but this pack's so small in the grand scheme of things that Mellow is able to just tear through it. And this is kind of the difference in Affliction. Like, we still need a bit of time to set up, but it's not as detrimental as it once was. Like, if we take into account how Affliction used to play, we wouldn't have even hit 30k there in that pack, I don't think. I think we would have been much closer to maybe 16, 17k, because we'd have just been starting off. Now, in hindsight, rewatching this key, what would have probably been more beneficial would have actually been to hold Dark Glare for what is about to come, because it gets a bit sloppy. Because we end up in this situation where theoretically you could pull everything here. And we do end up kind of in a scuffed situation where that ends up happening. But I won't tell you exactly how it happens. You'll find that out shortly. Now, this pack with kicks kind of need to be a little bit better on that. Obviously, we've got a bit going on in terms of trying to learn specs, so people are a little bit slow to kick where they should be. But you can actually see that I don't have a pet out at all currently, and I also am not using Grimmer of Sack. So I don't actually realise this as I'm playing it. Because I was so focused on trying to do damage, I didn't realise that, you know, my demon was dead, and I don't have Sack up, so I don't have access to the kick. Now, I do realise it in a moment, but we still end up in this situation where there's so much going on that, you know, I'm out of range of the tank now. I should really be combat resing. But unfortunately, I kind of realise a little bit too late that I'm out of range. One of the problems with trying to change your UI and play around with it, because at the moment I'm playing a mix between having the Blizzard's default UI with a few augmentations and trying to like maintain LVUI nameplates and things like that. In the end, I'm staying LVUI, really. But this is because I can better gauge where things are. Like, realising that the tank's out of range for Soulstone is never a good thing. Now, obviously, our good boy Colgorn is with us, our Fell Hunter, or Fell Observer, seeing as I use the glyph. But it's all squared, not too shabby. Now, we're just waiting on a ready. And everything's squared, applying a Shadow Core Oil, end up cancelling the cast and just going, because we end up in a situation where we pull everything, boss included, and Ned, bless him, as a Red Paladin, rips aggro, and we end up in this situation. Unfortunately, we can't res him, but thankfully, due to the high ad count, both me and Mello are able to pad dealing with most of the targets, with Soulflare doing a good amount of work onto the boss for us as well. And this is where the DPS starts trailing off a little. If I was to replay this fight, I would probably have bound Agony to a second macro, purely for the additional shard generation as we go through the rest of this pack, and the chance to reduce Dark Glare CD just that little bit faster. Now, I tried to be clever with Seed of Corruption and Vile Taint here to mass apply and get some Grim Reach damage going, but probably shouldn't have tried it. Should have just focused on doing damage and kiting this brute around. Now, a Curse of Exhaustion here would have been better, but that's just a finagling bit of, you know, watching it play back. Now, again, for that packed group there, Exhaustion, making use of Vile Taint maybe, or a Shadow Fury would have been good. You can see that a Dark Pact here, I dot things up, and we just then try and focus on doing damage while staying out of range. I Shadow Fury here, because I have multiple targets on me, and then just get out of range. We Vile Taint there for the Curse of Exhaustion. Now, the Curse of Exhaustion change means that we don't have Curse of Exhaustion up permanently anymore, but still, that application is enough that we are able to kite as a Warlock if we have multiple targets facing us. And with that, 50k DPS, pretty good. Now, obviously, Mello did 54, and this is where Mello starts to outstrip me in the dungeon. But this is because Fire has a much better single target profile than I do in my current build. Which, you know, is fine. We're both covering things. Now, as a Red Paladin, Ned doing a great job, but unfortunately they are very aggro heavy at the moment, which, when you have people learning how tanks have changed, is slightly problematic. Like, I did a key on Oramis, our original Ret, who is sitting at 270, 280 item level, and I was the tank's worst nightmare, which is a bit of a shame. But Ned's doing good for, unfortunately, the floor POV that we'd given him. Now, again, not much to say at this point. The AoE rotation's very much kind of the same, relying on Dark Glare, Vile Taint, Soul Flame, and being able to kind of push that damage out. There is a bug that you'll see during this boss fight that has thankfully now been fixed, but it does result in us pulling the Ritualist pack that you can see just to the right of the screen. It's not ideal, and it does kind of suck, But thankfully, as I say, that bug has been fixed, and it was actually being caused by me using the small little eye and using that as like an additional damage capstone trait. In an ideal setting, I probably should have tried picking up Inevitable Demise and used the Claw of Endereth, or Grim Harvest, I believe it's now called, rather than Claw of Endereth Legendary. And just to give us that extra little bit of single target damage and a little bit of cleave damage as well, because remember, Soul Rot does cause Drain Life to cleave for targets, and with Inevitable Demise constantly rolling through the applications of Vile Taint and just general agony applications itself, we'd have been in a really good spot of just being able to rapidly cleave things. Now, that build is obviously made a fair bit stronger when you consider that you can go into creeping agony and increase the tick rate of things like agony itself, which obviously increases the tick rate and the stack rate of ID. So, something to bear in mind. But we can get into that when it comes to proper Dragonflight builds, where I'll discuss all the variations there. For now, pre-patch, it's just fun memeing with some AoE. Now, not too much to say for Cilia itself. By this point through the majority of Shadowlands, we kind of know how this fight works. The assassins get spawned, and we end up kind of running into this situation. Unfortunately, this was a bit of a poor transition for us. We probably should have tried pumping out a little bit more damage, but still. Now, due to tank positioning, you obviously pull Cilia to one side of the room, and this is so that you have a little bit more space. Now, you can see that I'm Vile Tainting, casting Demonic Circle, and getting my Dark Glare out, because again, as we said, having that additional dot from Vile Taint helps our Dark Glare get damage, and unfortunately because of our eye, we did end up pulling the pack, so I have to get that Ritualist in with a kick, and one of the few reasons why I'm grateful I wasn't playing Demonology for this, because otherwise we would have just ended up in a stun and a recast. Now, I realise being kind of this far back that I have to be the one to soak the collapsing energy, and truth be told, this is a very new experience for me, because I've never really been the one that's had to do it in the past. It's usually been down on the healer. So I end up realising that there's still 2 soaks to go, and unfortunately I didn't soak it, so we end up with 2 applications of the dot, and Nadiv takes quite a bit of damage as a result of this, because he only has about 80k health total. But we handle it fairly well. Managed to reapply UA just in the nick of time. Need to be a little bit more proactive on that because that very nearly expired, which, although it doesn't necessarily matter for this build in particular, it does matter if you then start playing Malefic Affliction and going down the single target side, so it's best not to breed bad habits. But you can see that Cilia's going to drop now fairly easily. I'm next to the Collapsing Star, so I can soak them if needed, but this time Anastasia, our Shaman Healer, did the honours, and Cilia goes down. And it's a pretty easy 2-chested key. Now, we are going to go back to the end for a moment and just pause it. You can see that the overall DPS, if we just expand it slightly and move the thing, no, okay. Unfortunately, Windows Update, so I can't get rid of this bar, it would seem. But Melor ended the dungeon on 34.9k, and I ended the dungeon as an Affliction Warlock at 32.1. And when you consider that towards the end of the dungeon it was primarily single target with little elements of cleave here or there, our DPS didn't drop that much from the point at which we left the first zone and dealt with the first boss. So it's fair to say that taking that information with a Grimreach Affliction build and where our damage comes into it, Affliction's in a really good spot, especially if you want to dabble with it ahead of Dragonflight. It does obviously mean that you need a little bit of awareness in how the dungeon is played, because remember, if you don't have packs that are either priority target or packs of differing health, Soul Flame loses a little bit of value because it can't proc multiple times during a pack fight. In those particular dungeons and settings, what you're actually going to look at seeing more often than not is going to be a case of you just get one big Soul Flame at the end of the pack, which may or may not see use depending on the speed at which everything else is dying. A way to combat that would be to spec slightly more into a priority damage build, which we can discuss if you guys are interested, where you can kind of force it to become a carry. Because, as I say, for this particular dungeon, it equated to about 40% of my total damage, which is huge, given the fact that it is a passive talent that just happens when something dies. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this review. I will be doing the Demonology and Destruction ones today or tomorrow and the following day. And you can ask me any questions about the specs, and I will then start showing you dungeons where I play variant builds and kind of discuss and compare them as we continue going through the rest of this pre-patch and preparing for Dragonflight. Hope you all have a wonderful evening. If you've liked the video, hit me up with a subscribe. It'd be a lot, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care, folks, and have a good one.